Hello friends, so today's video is going to be a list of some books that I have unhauled and then some of which I have also DNF'd. I think a lot of you know I prefer to hype up the books that I've really enjoyed, but I know a lot of people in watching Unhauls and DNFs actually find books that they're interested in reading as a result, and so I like that by talking about, oh, here's something that didn't work for me, you might find something that would work for you. And then also, this just gives me a chance to hype up my local bookstores, which would be Changing Hands and Bookman's. It's where we take in, my husband and I, pretty much all of our books. I actually did a whole video a while back that's almost like a little mini tour of these bookstores, and if you ever get to come to Arizona, definitely try to find time to go to them because they're great. But jumping into the list of books that I unhauled and then DNF'd. The first one, I completed the whole book, and I actually didn't take it into one of my local bookstores. I'm giving it to a friend because she read this book as well, and she is planning on continuing on and reading the next book, and so I was like, hey, you can have my copy. And that would be Master of Jinn. I was having the best time with this book for so much of the book. It reminded me a little bit, for those of you that really enjoy Dresden Files, it reminded me a little bit of that. The setting is very different though. It takes place, it's kind of a mix of historical fantasy and murder mystery sort of a feel. So we follow a character that is kind of a magical detective, or a detective that is researching things to do with magic. And it is an alternate history, so there are magical creatures and beings that it's known to a lot of the world, and how the author takes that and puts it into history, I think is really interesting. And they did some really cool things with it. But the reason that I'm probably not going to continue on with this series is just that toward the end of the book, a lot of the really fun banter with the different characters, a lot of what made this book so exciting, by the end, I felt like when the stakes were just as high as they could be, it felt like those little bits of banter and humor were still happening in those moments, which then didn't really make me feel like the stakes were as high. It kind of just, it reminded me almost of, and I think a lot of you will know what I'm talking about, and then this might actually pique your interest and make you want to pick this book up, the Marvel movies. So the Marvel movies at this point, I'm like never concerned when I watch those, because I'm like, eh. And even when people do die in those movies, I'm like, whatever. I don't know. I just think that there's this certain tone that for me almost leans a little too, not happy, but sometimes too within the fun factor. And it's a very difficult line for my personal taste, because something like Full Metal Alchemist is like the perfect amount of cheeky and silly and funny, and then also like, oh my gosh, this is so tragic and this is so dark, and it combines it really well. But I don't feel like in that, when the dark, sad, tragic moments are happening, that our characters are still like messing around and joking around and stuff. I think that those moments get the weight that I am craving, and in this book, I just felt like some of those heavier moments did not have the weight that I was craving. However, I still highly recommend it, and I definitely still want to check out some other things by this author. A couple of the other ones on this list, I was pretty sure I wasn't going to love these, but I kind of took it upon myself to read through as many of the both young adult and adult Goodreads nominees from last year, and I'll have some of my videos linked where I go through a lot of them in a wrap-up style. But in trying to read a lot of the nominees, obviously some of them, there's a reason I hadn't already picked them up, and it's because I just wasn't thinking they were going to fit my personal reading taste, and then that just proved true. So Lore and Realmbreaker, I didn't dislike either of these. I was actually really enjoying Realmbreaker for a while, but with both of them, I'm trying to be better about recognizing when something is sort of putting me into a reading slump, when I'm not extremely excited to pick the book back up, of just deciding it would be better if I put it down, I took it into my used bookstore, and somebody else could find it for a discounted price, and better that they have something and that they love it than for me to hold on to it just to say I finished it. And in doing that, it allows me to then pick up something else and then actually read more, which sounds kind of the opposite. You would think if you're DNFing, you're reading less, but it doesn't put me in a slump. And I think with both of these, nothing really I thought was particularly wrong or bad about them. Realmbreaker follows a lot of different characters. It's technically, I believe, young adult, but I think it leans sort of, it's not that it feels more mature, but it definitely feels very large. And so I think it might be a very good one to pick up if a younger reader needs to kind of find something that's epic and get that first taste of epic fantasy without maybe jumping into some of the, Stormlight Archive or something, right? So I think it's a good first book, or somebody who maybe typically reads young adult, and same thing, maybe they're not younger, they just are a little daunted by, intimidated by these really big epic fantasy books, and they're like, I need something that's gonna sort of allow me to test the waters. I think that Realmbreaker is gonna fit that very well. And then with lore, I thought that so much about it was so interesting, the way that the author was tying in mythology into modern day and how our main character fit within that. But I also, it's not that I felt really confused, it's that I felt a lack of connection a little bit to our main character, because it felt almost like we were jumping into a sequel. There were a lot of things that had clearly happened in the character's past, and it wasn't just like, here's this one incident that happened in my past that's affecting me, that also affects this plot moving forward. It was like, this part of my past, and then also this part over here, and then also this part over here. So it just felt like so many things had happened in this character's past that have turned them into the character they are now. But it felt like I needed a first book to have gotten to know the character and have seen some of those events. And then in this story, then I feel like I know this character and I understand why those moments in their past are so significant. So when the plot started to move forward, I just didn't feel like I had that connection with the character that I had been craving. And other people are going to love it so much more, especially if you are somebody who really likes the mythology tied into a modern setting. That was really cool. And a little bit, I thought that the main character reminded me of Vi from Arcane, and I love Vi so much, and I love Arcane so much, especially Vi though. I love Vi so much. So the main character reminded me of her a little bit. So if you also, like me, are a little obsessed with Vi, maybe this book could be for you. A couple of new releases that I ended up DNFing. We have Ivory Key, Amber Crown, and Age of Ash. I did go into more detail about these in some wrap-up videos where I talked about them. And with Amber Crown, I DNF'd it basically immediately. There is some very explicit sexual content right away, and it's not that made me want to put the book down, but rather it's because the perspective that you were getting this content through was just, when I say gross, I don't mean like, ugh, how dare you want to do that thing. It was more like the way they thought of the person that they were doing things with. It was like really belittling, and I was like, ugh. Like I just wasn't a fan. And I understand it's a book, and that sometimes we are in the heads of really disgusting people, but I think I just wasn't interested in continuing on with being in that person's head. And then with Ivory Key, the plot seemed so cool, and we follow these different siblings. The very beginning, you have this character who is trying to secure a marriage with someone who will help keep their country afloat, because they are very much struggling, and then right away something has happened to the person that they were supposed to be betrothed to, and now they're having to deal with that on top of the fact that, well, who's going to want to ally with them now? And I'm like, oh, this is a great premise. I do think though that the tone felt very, very young. And it is a young adult book, and just somebody who, I'm 29, sometimes it's sort of difficult because young adult is such a broad age range in that it's 12 to 18, and obviously that's not a big amount of years, but a 12-year-old is very different from an 18-year-old. And just because it starts at 12 doesn't mean that some books aren't good for people who are 11 or 10 or 9 who are getting into young adult. So this story just for me felt like it was maybe leaning a little on the young side in a way that I ultimately didn't feel like I was the target audience for. And then with Age of Ash, this is another one that I did ultimately put down. I read a pretty good amount of it, and just how the author goes about world building is not my favorite way to have the world explored. It's very much, you get a bird's eye view, you get told a lot about the history of this area, the culture of this area, and you kind of start up here and you're being told about it, and you slowly zero into a character. And then once you have all that information, then you start to follow the character. And I much prefer to see the world through the character's eyes. So it's one thing if you start a book and you sort of set up the setting in this way, but it wasn't just that. It was that the author would kind of continuously do this throughout various different chapters. And for me, I got a decent amount through the book, and it felt like I'm such a character-driven reader, and it just felt like I wasn't seeing much with the characters, and I wanted more of the characters, and I think that's just how that author was laying out the story and the setting for us. And I compared it a little bit to Malazan, Book of the Fallen, and Lies of Locke Lamora, in the way that those authors, I think, also described their settings. The last of the books that I DNF'd and also took in would be Merciful Crow and its sequel. I bought the sequel because it's just a duology, and I read the book Little Thieves by this author, and I really, really liked Little Thieves. But this is one where I picked up kind of what I was saying earlier about I'm starting to try to be better about recognizing when starting a book is putting me in a reading slump, and that was just the case with this one. I couldn't tell you all that much about it because pretty quickly I just wasn't finding myself connecting to it. So this one ultimately was one that I took in. I also took in Rebel Rose. This is one that I completed a little while back, and it's sort of a historical fiction where we're taking basically Disney princesses and putting them in real moments in history. So what would happen if the characters from Beauty and the Beast were having to deal with the things involved with the French Revolution? And I was like, that sounds awesome. And there were parts of it that I really, really liked. I think there was a lot more discussion about class issues than I was expecting, which I was surprised by and I really enjoyed. And I was wanting for a while to pick up other books in this series because the series follows different characters in different points in history, different princesses. And I think they're all going to be slightly connected. But I do think that the book did not dive as deep when I reflect back on it as much as I wanted. It's more like the French Revolution is happening over there, and our character is trying to ensure that it doesn't happen over here. So you're not really seeing the French Revolution as much as I had hoped. And it doesn't get quite as dark and quite as gritty as I was wanting. Not saying I needed it to be a ton of violence or something and like, why aren't more people being killed? It's not that I needed more of that. I just felt like it felt distant from where we were. That is it for my Unhaul and DNFs. Like I said at the beginning, in doing this, my goal is not to dissuade people from picking books up, but to hopefully you can find some books that you now want to read. And so I will have purchase links to all of these in the description bar down below. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.